A miracle has happened. That's how World Champion Max Euwe described the fantastic trap set by the great Bobby Fischer in the game we analyzed today. First, we'll see how Fischer sets the stage for the trap with sophisticated positional moves. Then I'll challenge you to pause the video and find Fischer's miraculous idea. And finally, we'll witness Fischer's brilliant endgame technique. Let's dive in. Fischer starts with e4, his opponent Samuel Schweber plays the French defense, e6, d4, d5. Black is attacking the e4 pawn and Fischer goes for probably the most popular line, knight c3, defending the e4 pawn. Black goes for the Wiener variation, bishop b4, pinning the knight and renewing the threat of d takes e, so Fischer pushes the pawn forward, getting the space advantage on the king side. Black in his turn plays c5, initiating the counterplay on the queen side and attacking the base of white's pawn chain, the d4 pawn. And as the white knight is on c3, white cannot retain the pawn chain by playing c3, by playing the pawn to c3. But the c5 pawn closes the retreating diagonal of the bishop, so white plays a3, the bishop cannot retreat, so black has only two moves. Either bishop a5, trying to retain the valuable bishop, but in this case white has an energetic move invented by Alekhine, b4, which leads to a sharp tactical battle, or a more common bishop takes c3 check, which is the case in our game. After which, of course, white gets the advantage of two bishops, and the dark squares in black's position are seriously weakened, as black doesn't have the dark square bishop to defend them anymore. On the other hand, in his turn, black managed to destroy white's queen side. Queen c7 follows, developing the queen, putting pressure on the c-file, and the queen might also take part in the defense of the king side. For example, if white goes for the sharpest line, queen g4, attacking the weak g7 pawn, black has an option of f5 and the queen defends the g7 pawn. Besides that, by playing queen c7, black has moved the queen away from the king's way, so black considers the long castle, which is one of the main ideas, one of the most logical things to do in this variation, because white has the space advantage on the king side. The king, the black king, might be safer on the queen side. And another idea for black is f6, attacking white's center. Instead of the sharpest line, queen g4, Fischer opts for a quieter and a more positional line, knight f3. Black develops another piece on the queen side, knight c6, moving the knight away from the king's way, and the knight puts pressure, more pressure on white's center. Of course, white would love to develop the bishop on the active d3 square, but in this case, black would get a chance to push the pawn forward with a tempo, and the bishop would be forced to retreat, so instead of bishop d3, Fischer plays bishop e2. Bishop d7. The last piece on the queen side is developed. The king is ready to castle queen side. Fischer castles king side. Black doesn't hurry with the long castle. Instead, he develops the last minor piece. So he still might consider the short castle. So he keeps both options alive. Fischer makes the standard move for white in the Wiener variation, a4. The idea is to vacate the a3 square for the bishop, so white is thinking about bishop a3 next move, and the bishop will put a very unpleasant pressure on this diagonal, attacking the c5 pawn and eyeing the weak d6 square. And the main line for black in this position is f6, attacking the center. But in our game, instead of f6, in the anticipation of bishop a3, black plays knight a5, which isn't the best move, to put it mildly. After this, white seizes the initiative. So knight a5 has its idea, of course. The knight has moved away from the queen's way, so the queen defends the c5 pawn. The bishop's diagonal is also open, so the bishop is eyeing the a4 pawn, the weak isolated pawn. And indeed, if white plays bishop a3, which he intended to, attacking the c5 pawn, black simply plays b6, the c5 pawn is defended, and the a4 pawn is under attack. And it turns out that the best thing white can do in this position is to return the bishop to c1. But of course, white isn't forced to play bishop a3. So Fischer realizes that bishop a3 now that black has played knight a5, would be in black's favor, so instead he makes a much stronger move, rook e1, developing the rook, overprotecting the strong point, the e5 pawn, in accordance with Aron Nemcovic's teaching, and the rook might be rerouted to one of these squares later in the game. So Fischer is planning to execute the rook lift, rook e3, followed by rook f3 or rook g3 or rook h3. What should black do now? So now that the white rook is on e1 on the same file with the black king, the king is still in the center, f6 looks too dangerous. The center would open in this case, and after d takes c, white has very dangerous ideas. The d4 square is vacated for the knight, so white can play knight d4, attacking the e6 pawn. After that he might play bishop h5 check, with a tempo moving the bishop away from the rook's way. The rook will also attack the e6 pawn, and black's position might collapse very soon. So f6, the standard move, doesn't work. It's too late. That's why knight a5 was a mistake. Black had to play f6 when it was still possible. Now he will remain passive. What else can black do? The long castle is also dangerous. That would be a dubious decision, because now that the black king is on c8, white can play bishop a3, attacking the c5 pawn. The only defense of the pawn is b6, but white can simply capture, which leads to the opening of the b file. The a4 pawn isn't so important anymore. White can, of course, sacrifice it, because he gets a chance to initiate a devastating attack with rook b1, and deadly bishop a6 check is threatened. What else can black do? f6 or long castle don't work. The short castle was possible. The engine says it's possible, but for a human, of course, it looks dangerous, because white has the space advantage on the king side, and the black king might turn into a target of a terrible attack, which white can initiate with h4. And white has multiple ideas, such as h5, h6, destroying black's king side. Besides that, after he played h4, the h2 square is vacated, so white can play knight h2, knight g4, bringing the knight into the attack. The knight, of course, is eyeing the important squares f6 and h6. Then white can play bishop d3, attacking h7. Then from g4 the knight might jump on f6 check with a check, sacrificing itself, after which the queen will invade the g4 square. The bishop, the dark squared bishop, might join the attack. So all this, of course, looks very dangerous for a human, and it's understandable that Schweber doesn't feel like castling kingside. So instead he captures on d4, opening the c file. His main chances for the counterplay are related to the c file. And the queen also takes the c4 square under control, and the knight will invade on this great square later in the game. But of course, c takes d lets Fischer undouble his pawns. So c takes d follows. If black castles queenside now, then bishop a3 would follow again with a tempo. So the king isn't defending the knight anymore, and after black defends the knight, the white bishop invades the d6 square with a tempo, and again the black king might fall under attack. So black doesn't castle kingside. Instead he plays, as he intended to, knight c4. The knight takes the a3 square under control. Now if white plays bishop a3, of course black would be glad to exchange the knight for white's valuable bishop. So white isn't going to play it. And of course, if white captures this strong knight, that would be in black's favor, because black captures with the queen. The queen puts pressure on the c2 pawn. The c2 pawn is weak now. Rook c8 would follow, increasing the pressure on the c file. The bishop, together with the queen, is attacking the weak a4 pawn. So, of course, capturing this knight, this annoying knight, isn't good for white. And now that the knight is on c4 and it controls the a3 square, so white cannot play bishop a3, black is ready to castle queenside. And the short castle is also possible, actually. But with his next move, Fischer prevents both of these ideas. He plays bishop d3. Now that black doesn't have the pawn on c5 to push it on c4, bishop d3 makes perfect sense. The bishop is eyeing the h7 pawn. That means if black castles kingside, he loses on the spot because white has the standard sacrifice on h7 followed by knight g5 check. Now, of course, if the king moves to g8, queen h5, threatening checkmate would follow and there is no satisfactory defense. So the best move would be king g6, but of course the king would get in trouble after queen g4. White threatens knight takes e6 with the discovered attack, so black is in trouble. So the short castle doesn't work, and if black castles queenside instead, the king doesn't defend the f7 pawn anymore, and white plays knight g5, attacking the f7 pawn and also the h7 pawn together with the bishop. So black, of course, must defend the h7 pawn, after which white captures on h7 and wins a pawn. For this reason, black doesn't castle neither kingside nor queenside. Instead, he plays h6, moving the pawn away from h7 so that white doesn't have the sacrifice in case black castles kingside, and also taking the g5 square under control, preventing knight g5, and that means black again is ready to castle both kingside or queenside. And still, if white captures the knight, as we remember, black will recapture with the queen and will get a very strong, a very good counterplay on the queen side. But Fischer makes another strong move, knight d2, attacking the knight for the second time. And that means now he is ready to capture this knight with the bishop. Black won't be able to recapture with the queen, because the knight, of course, also attacks the c4 square. So black would be forced to recapture the bishop with the pawn. The c-file would be closed after that. Black would lose his counter chances. And besides that, the black pawn would move to c4. It would stop defending the e4 square, and the white knight would invade it. And, of course, next move, it will jump on the great d6 square. Besides that, by playing knight d2, which was a really strong move, Fischer opens the queen's diagonal. She is ready to move to g4, attacking the weak g7 pawn. So, in order to parry the threat of bishop takes c4, followed by knight e4, black captures on d2, exchanging the knights. Bishop takes d2 follows. Now, the engine still recommends the short castle, but of course to a human that looks dangerous because both white bishops are attacking the king side. White will play queen g4, then the rook via e3 will also join the attack, so it looks really, really dangerous for a human. And if black castles queenside, that would be a mistake because white can play bishop b4, again attacking the knight, and after black defends the knight, the bishop invades the d6 square, and that might lead to a very dangerous attack. For this reason, again, black doesn't castle anywhere. Instead, he plays knight c6, attacking the d4 square, the d4 pawn, and also taking the b4 square under control, preventing bishop b4, and that means black is ready to castle queenside. Fischer plays queen g4, defending the pawn and attacking the g7 pawn. So, of course, now castling kingside is out of question. So, black plays g6 to save the pawn, and rook e. It might seem that white can sacrifice a bishop, and indeed, if black accepts the sacrifice, he is losing on the spot after queen takes g6 check, and let's say if black tries to escape the king to the queen side, he is losing after queen f6 check, the rook falls. However, after bishop takes g6, black isn't forced to accept the sacrifice. Instead, he has a much stronger move, rook g8, pinning the bishop, so the bishop would be lost. The best thing white can do is to capture the f7 pawn too, but after king takes f7, the rook is defended, the white queen is under attack, and white doesn't have sufficient attacking resources, so his attack fades away. For this reason, Fischer doesn't capture on g6, instead he brings the rook into the attack. And now that the rook has joined the attack, white is ready to capture on g6. And after rook g8, bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, white would play rook f3 check. And the queen, the rook, and the dark squared bishop will, of course, create serious threats to the black king. That's why black evacuates the king to the queenside. He finally castles queenside. And we have reached a very important moment of the game. So how should white continue? How should he increase the pressure? Black's main weakness at this point is the f7 pawn. So the most logical move would be rook f3, putting more pressure on the pawn. However, in this case, instead of passively defending this pawn, black has a great idea. He can create a very good counterplay by playing f5, attacking the queen. And the queen, don't forget that the queen is tied to the defense of the pawn. So, for example, if white captures on g6, he loses a valuable central pawn with a tempo, and the e5 pawn also becomes weak after that. So, after f5, what else can white do? If he tries to simply move the queen, like let's say queen f4, so that she still keeps an eye on the pawn, then black of course plays g5, then f4, the queen must move away, and again the d4 pawn would fall. And finally, which is very important, if white plays rook f3, so after f5, if instead of capturing on g6, white captures en passant, then the black pawn will move forward with a tempo, attacking the queen, and that's why rook f3 doesn't work. The rook and the bishop, after the white queen moves away, can be forked. The e4 would follow with a fork, and white loses a piece. For this reason, rook f3 right away doesn't work. Black has a strong reply f5. But Fischer notices that had the black king been on b8 instead of c8, rook f3 would work. But how to make black play king b8? And we will see why it's so important later. So Fischer makes, as Euwe writes, an indifferent move that doesn't accomplish anything. Instead of rook f3, he plays rook g3, which doesn't create any threats. But what should black do now? So the white rook isn't on f3, so this f5 move, the active move, doesn't work because white simply captures and gets a very dangerous passed pawn, and after e5 with the attack on the queen, white simply captures one more pawn, and e4 isn't a fork anymore. The white rook isn't on f3, so white will simply move the bishop away. So what can black do? What active plan does he have? f5 doesn't work. And besides that, the black king and the black queen are both on the c file, and white might play c4 later in the game. Opening the c file, followed by rook c1, then he can bring the second rook on this file, putting a very unpleasant pressure. So the most logical thing for black to do is king b8. And that's exactly what he does, moving the king away from the c file. Later in the game, he can play king a8, moving the king away from the half-open b file too. After that, the black king would be absolutely safe on the a8 square. Besides that, by playing king b8, black has vacated the c8 square for the rook, so he's going to play rook c8, and he hopes to create some counter chances on the c file. However, as Euwe writes, by playing king b8, black swallows the bait. So let's see why it's so important for white to induce the black king to move to b8. Now that he is on b8, the rook moves to f3, attacking the f7 pawn. Had black known what Fischer prepared, he would have passively defended the pawn, let's say by playing rook h7. Of course, in this case, white invades the weak f6 square, blockading the f7 pawn, so black would never play f5 anymore, and black's position is paralyzed. However, it would have been better for black than what he did. And what he did, of course, is f5. The move that looks very active, and indeed at first sight black gets very good counterplay. And indeed it's almost impossible to notice why f5 is a mistake. So let's see why. Fischer has in mind a fantastic trap. So he captures en passant, getting a valuable passed pawn, but black, as he intended to, plays e5, attacking the queen, and also he's ready to play e4 with a fork. And if white captures on g6, that might give black serious counter chances on the g file, so he might play, so the g file opens in this case, and he might play rook g8, attacking the queen. If she moves to h5 now, bishop g4 with the double attack would follow, and if she moves to f7, black has a simple tactical shot, rook takes g2 check, and white cannot capture the rook because of bishop h3 check with the discovered attack on the queen. The white queen is lost. For this reason, Fischer doesn't capture on g6. Instead, he prepared queen g3, putting more pressure on the e5 pawn. And now we can see why it was so important to induce the black king to move to b8. The king has moved away from the c file, but he is standing on this diagonal now, together with the black queen, and the queen might get pinned. So black cannot play e4. That would be a terrible mistake because of simple bishop f4, and black is losing the queen. But what if instead of playing e4, black simply captures the valuable central pawn with a tempo, attacking the rook? Fischer prepared rook e3, attacking the e5 pawn. However, the rook is closing the bishop's diagonal. This bishop's diagonal. Now the bishop won't be able to move to f4 to pin the black queen. So now black plays e4, saving his pawn, which was under attack on e5, attacking the bishop, and offering the exchange of the queens, which of course would be in black's favor. If the queens are exchanged, white's initiative might fade away, and white would lose his advantage. So he might have only a slight advantage in the endgame, and black would get very good chances to make a draw. So we have reached the critical position. Let's say if the bishop, which is under attack, retreats, let's say if it moves to f1, black simply exchanges the queens, and the endgame is more or less equal. White has only a slight advantage. So you can pause the video now and find Fischer's miraculous trap. So the move is rook takes e4. It looks like a terrible blunder at first sight. It's true. If black captures the rook, he is losing on the spot for the same reason, bishop f4, and black is losing the queen. But what if instead of capturing the rook, black simply exchanges the queens, and the white rook is still under attack? So Fischer's idea isn't an easy one to spot, so I'll give you one more chance in case you didn't find it earlier. You can pause the video one more time and find the point of Fischer's combination. So if white makes the obvious move, and the vast majority of the chess players in the calculations, so after black captured on g3, would consider the only move, just to recapture the queen. So after white recaptures, black captures the rook and he is up a rook, and most chess players would stop their calculations at this point and wouldn't go for this whole variation, but not Fischer. He calculated further. So after queen takes g3, he notices that it isn't necessary to capture the queen. So instead, his rook is under attack. He saves the rook, captures the knight, and the black queen is still under attack. And as Euwe writes, the miracle has happened. The queen has no squares to retreat. The white rook controls the 4th rank. The bishop, the dark squared bishop, controls the g5 square. And if the black queen retreats to any of these squares, which are on the same diagonal with the black king, let's say to c7, it doesn't really matter. Again, bishop f4 would follow, the bishop would be exchanged for the queen, and white would remain with an extra pawn. And what a pawn? A passed pawn. So white is winning. But what if Fischer's combination isn't over yet? But what if the queen, of course, is doomed? But what if instead of exchanging her for the bishop, black exchanges the queen for the rook and gets the material advantage? That's exactly what he does. Queen g4, forcing white to give up the rook for the queen. Rook takes g4, bishop takes g4, and black is up the exchange. But Fischer had foreseen all this. Although he's down the exchange, for the exchange he has a pawn, and he gets the second pawn for it. Besides that, he has a dangerous passed pawn and monster bishops which dominate the whole board, and the black rooks prove to be completely ineffective. So what should black do now? If he tries to stop the pawn, let's say if he plays rook f8 attacking it, then the pawn simply moves forward and bishop takes h6 is coming. So rook f8 doesn't work for this reason. Schweber plays rook g8 attacking the bishop, bishop h7 attacking the rook. If the rook moves to f8, white can simply capture on h6, and after rook takes bishop g5, black is losing one of the rooks, and white simply gets 2 extra pawns. For this reason, rook h8 follows, attacking the bishop, bishop d3. Now, if rook f8 again, bishop captures, bishop g5. If another rook moves to f8, then it stops supporting the d5 pawn, and white can defend the pawn with bishop c3. There is no d4 move anymore. For this reason, black plays rook e8, but another brilliant idea by Fischer follows. He plays f7, attacking the rook. If rook f8, then bishop c3, and the rook, which is under attack, has no squares to move. That's why rook e7 follows, and now Fischer sacrifices the pawn in order to get the exchange back, forcing black to capture. Now these rooks are on the same diagonal, and bishop b4 comes. Black is losing one of his rooks, after which white has an extra pawn. And he has, of course, the king majority on the pawn majority on the king side. So he will create 2 connected passed pawns on this side of the board. f3, bishop d7, eyeing the a4 pawn, and black is ready to play a5, fixing the white pawn on this square, and the white rook would be tied to its defense. But Fischer prevents it by playing a5 himself. King c7 follows, king f2, bringing the king closer to the center, rook f7, king e3, king d6, g3, the pawn majority starts its advance, king c5, f4, bishop g4, rook b1, attacking the pawn, tying the black rook to its defense, rook e7 check, king d2, in order to untie the rook. Black plays b6, but this lets white get rid of his isolated a pawn, a takes b, h3. It turns out that h3 was another brilliant move by Fischer. If black captures, of course, rook h1 follows, followed by rook takes h6, and white gets 2 connected passed pawns. That's why instead of capturing the pawn, bishop d7 follows. Now g4, the majority continues its advance, d4, f5, rook e3 attacking the pawn, another brilliant move by Fischer, f6 ignoring the attack. It turns out that if black captures the pawn, then f7 would follow. The only way of stopping the pawn is rook f3, but of course white can play either rook f1 or a more beautiful bishop f5, closing the rook's file, and the pawn will promote. That's why black doesn't capture on h3. Instead he plays rook f3 attacking the pawn, but of course rook f1 follows, defending the pawn. The rooks are exchanged, the pawn is ready to move, bishop e6 stopping it, but as there is no way black can stop the advance of the white pawns, so white will create two connected passed pawns. Black, without waiting for Fischer's reply, resigned in this position. And now I recommend watching an even more spectacular queen trap set by Ludek Pachman. But first, I'd be grateful if you like this video, write comments, share and subscribe, as all this is really helpful for the channel growth.